Hi class, let's talk about the second system of Unit 5, which is the digestive system. The main functions of this system are obviously to break down the food that goes into your body, but then on the way through, your body breaks it down into smaller absorbable nutrients, and we'll talk about how that happens, and then anything that's left over needs to be eliminated as waste. The entire process is broken down into four main parts: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. And the system involves some major organs from the mouth, esophagus, liver, down to the small and large intestines, and a few in between there as well. Looking at the phases of digestion, so the first part is going to be obvious. We'll talk about the details of each of these, but food's going to be taken into the body. And then immediately it's going to start being digested, and there's a few ways that could happen. And then once it gets further down in your digestive system, particularly the small intestine, that's where the absorption of nutrients occurs, and finally the leftover stuff will be eliminated. Looking more in detail into each of these processes, the first one, ingestion, is simply the process of eating food. So picking up some food and putting it into your mouth, that's ingestion. And it obviously starts at the mouth as well. Now after that, as soon as you put it into your mouth, the second process and phase occurs, which is digestion. Now digestion is broken down into two main parts: mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. Mechanical is just a physical breakdown of big food into smaller food chunks, and chemical digestion is really where enzymes are coming in there and breaking down those large macromolecules into things like monomers that can be absorbed as small molecules further down the system. The next phase is absorption. This is when those molecules from the food are small enough that they can be absorbed directly into the bloodstream by diffusion and osmosis, and then circulated to all the cells in your body to give them the nutrition that they need. Those macromolecules need to be broken down into those monomers. Remember that macromolecules, proteins, carbs, lipids, nucleic acids, that those are all made of small molecules called monomers, like monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol. They're small components. That's what the digestion process is trying to get down to. And those are the molecules that can be absorbed in the small intestine into your blood, which can take it to your cells. And finally, anything that's undigested and unabsorbable, things like fiber, those things need to leave, and they will be passed out in a process called elimination as feces. One of the fun facts I like to talk about with the digestive system is that when you ingest food and you chew it up and you swallow it, it's not actually in you. It's technically going through you. And that's because it's going through a tube that leads from one end to the other, and that tube is called the alimentary canal. It's also known as the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. And the food that you put in one end has to go through a series of organs that continue. They coil, they twist, they turn into different organs as they go. So from your mouth to your esophagus to your stomach to your small intestine to your large intestine, and that coiling tube that goes 30 feet from one end to the other end is technically, what's inside of it is not actually in your body, it's going through your body. The molecules that are going through it don't actually get into you until you absorb them in your small intestine or in your large intestine, like with water. And hopefully that makes sense as we go through this. So the alimentary canal, or the GI tract, deals with starting at the mouth, and then it goes to the pharynx, then into the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine, and the last part of the large intestine is the anus, which is the exit point. And we're going to talk about all these parts of the GI tract and some accessory organs along the way that help in the digestive process. Some of those accessory organs that I just mentioned that are part of digestion, but they're not part of the GI tract, so the coiled tube that leads from mouth to anus, those include things like your teeth, your salivary glands that produce saliva, your pancreas, your liver, and your gallbladder. And we're going to talk about what each one of these accessory organs do during the process of digestion. Starting at the beginning of the digestive process, it begins with the mouth or the oral cavity. Once you ingest food into your mouth, then the digestive phase actually begins, mainly with your teeth, your tongue, and your salivary glands. Your teeth and your tongue do mechanical digestion. They just physically break down the large food into smaller food pieces. And you have 4 different types of teeth. You have incisors, you have canines, you have premolars, and way in the back you have molars. The premolars are also known as bicuspids. But the front ones, the incisors and the canines, those are used to rip and tear food, and then once it's in your mouth, your molars and your premolars crush and grind it into smaller pieces. During that process, your salivary glands, they assist with chemical digestion. They're producing saliva, which contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, and amylase is an enzyme that breaks down starch. So you start to break down large carbohydrates like starch into their smaller molecules and monosaccharides immediately right in your mouth as you put it in, as the food mixes with your saliva. It also helps lubricate your mouth, and it helps neutralize acids and kills bacteria because of the slightly acidic nature of that saliva. It's one of your first lines of defense with the barrier and the mucous membranes from the immune system when we talked about it. As food is in your mouth getting digested, not only are the teeth breaking it down, but the tongue is helping to move it around under the teeth and getting it broken up, and also mixing it up with the saliva that your salivary glands are producing. This clump of chewed up food that's produced in your mouth is called a bolus. And what's going to happen when you're ready to swallow, your tongue lifts up to your hard palate and pushes the bolus to the back of your pharynx. That initiates and triggers your swallowing reflex, where that bolus gets pushed down into your esophagus, and what will happen when you swallow, your larynx rises, as we talked about with the respiratory system, and that epiglottis, that trap door over the trachea and the larynx, flips down to direct that bolus down your esophagus instead of down your trachea. So looking at the picture here, you could see how it's showing the bolus shown in green, and then in the second picture it gets pushed back and down your esophagus, but that's because this epiglottis tipped over the larynx and the trachea, so it doesn't go down into your lungs, it goes down the esophagus, which will lead to the stomach instead. If food does happen to slip by the epiglottis and go down into the trachea, that's where the coughing reflex occurs, and you will cough up whatever went down the wrong pipe back up into your pharynx. So once you swallow the food goes down a muscular tube called the esophagus. Other than transporting the bolus of food from your mouth to your stomach, that's pretty much all the esophagus is good for. However, in order to get down into your stomach, the food needs to be pushed in that direction. And that pushing happens with involuntary muscular contractions called peristalsis. So peristalsis happens in a rhythmic domino effect down the length of your esophagus, and it will push it in the right direction into the stomach. Peristalsis doesn't only happen in the esophagus, but it happens throughout all the other gastrointestinal tract organs to that alimentary canal, in order for the food to get pushed in the proper direction. So once the bolus goes through the esophagus leads to the stomach. The stomach is a kind of, when we dissect the pig, it looks like a deflated balloon when we dissect the pig. So it's just hollow kind of a sac in your left part of your abdomen. And the stomach is lined with these multiple folds called rugae. You could see them in the picture over there. And those rugae are lined with millions of glands, gastric glands and mucus glands. The gastric glands secrete gastric juices, so your stomach acid in essence. And your stomach acid contains a variety of things, including enzymes to help chemically break food down, hormones, mucus. The mucus helps protect the lining of your stomach, so in essence, your stomach doesn't digest itself. That's because there's a nice thick layer of mucus that helps protect it, and some hydrochloric acid, of course, to help in the digestion process. The stomach gastric juice is very acidic because of that hydrochloric acid. Some people tend to get these things called ulcers, stomach ulcers, and that's because the mucus tends to become very thin or non-existent in certain locations within the stomach lining, and that means that the gastric juices within there and the hydrochloric acid start to eat away at your stomach tissue and could cause bleeding and whatnot and a lot of pain. If some of the gastric juice goes in reverse direction and back up the esophagus, so there's a little kind of muscle called a sphincter. This one's called the esophageal sphincter. If this lets some of the gastric stomach juice back up into the esophagus is not covered with mucus. And so that starts to eat away, the acid starts to eat away at your esophageal lining and cause what we know as heartburn or acid reflux. The stomach is also involved in mechanical digestion. At the same time, it's involved with chemical digestion. When the bolus enters the stomach, there's smooth muscle contractions within the stomach that start to physically mix the bolus in with all the gastric acid and other juices and enzymes within the stomach. As this mixing process occurs, the bolus gets broken down even further mechanically into mush that we call chyme. It has sort of an oatmeal-like texture, and it's going to leak out gradually into the next part of the GI tract, which is the small intestine. So once the chyme leaves the stomach, it will enter the first part of the small intestine. And this is where a little bit more chemical digestion needs to occur before we absorb anything. The chyme will mix with enzymes and different fluids that are secreted from the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. And as you can see in the picture, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder all have ducts that lead into the small intestine, so the things that they make could enter the small intestine and help with the chemical breakdown. The pancreas we'll talk about first. The pancreas has many jobs, but one of its digestive jobs is to help neutralize the stomach acid, the hydrochloric acid from the stomach. Remember that the stomach has a very nice mucus lining, but other organs don't really have that mucus lining. So we need to neutralize that, not to prevent injury to the tissue. So that's the first thing it will do. Then it also secretes different enzymes. It will create pancreatic amylase, which makes starch break down into smaller pieces. We all have salivary amylase in the mouth that breaks down starch, but the pancreas also produces it, and the stuff that it produces is called pancreatic amylase. It also produces trypsin, which is an enzyme that helps break down proteins, and it also produces lipases. Lipases are enzymes that help break down fats. So we're still doing a chemical breakdown of the molecules. The liver is the second largest organ in the human body behind the skin. It weighs something like 3 pounds and has about 500 different functions, but we're only going to talk about the major digestive functions of the liver. First of all, your liver is very good at removing excess glucose from the blood. And when it does this, it takes the glucose and links them together into a polysaccharide that we call glycogen. And glycogen can stay stored in your liver and can be broken down back into glucose if needed. The second thing that your liver can do is help detoxify substances. Your liver cells are called hepatocytes, and hepatocytes are known to be chock full of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth ER has a main function of detoxifying things. So there's lots of smooth ER in your liver cells, and anything that comes in that's toxic, drugs and alcohol, they will be sent to your liver, and your liver cells will break it down into non-toxic substances. Your liver is also good at making lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are important because they travel in the blood and they carry cholesterol to your cells. Every cell needs cholesterol. It's a major component of your cell membranes, as well as a major component of hormones, lipid hormones in your body. So cholesterol needs to get around and lipoproteins will carry it to those locations. Your liver also makes bile. Bile is a fluid that contains salts, and its main job is to break down fats as they enter the small intestine. When the bile is produced, it will actually be sent to an area called the gallbladder, which is shown in green right here. And the gallbladder holds on to the bile and stores it until it's actually needed for digestive purposes in the small intestine. And then it will travel down that duct into the small intestine to help break down fats. So the liver makes bile, the gallbladder stores bile. Some people tend to have a gallbladder issue for one reason or another, and they could have their gallbladder removed because it's really an unnecessary organ. If it's removed, then the liver directly dumps the bile into the small intestine instead. After chemical digestion occurs at the beginning of the small intestine with the help of the liver and the pancreas, as the chyme moves further down into the small intestine, it's broken down far enough that it can now be absorbed into the body. The absorption of the nutrients occurs through the walls of the small intestine. And the walls of the small intestine have all these folds on them called villi. And the villi have more folds on top of them called microvilli. If you look at the picture up here, you could see a section of the small intestine with all those folds. And here's one of the villi. But as you could see, if you zoom in on one of the villi have more villi, and those are called microvilli. All this folding and finger-like projections are what increase the surface area of the small intestine, and with more surface area, you could have more absorption of more nutrients. Now, the nutrients that are going to be absorbed in the lining of the small intestine includes amino acids, which are the main building block of proteins, the monomer of proteins, basic monosaccharides or sugars, which are the basic building block of carbohydrates, and they're both going to be absorbed directly into the blood through the blood capillaries and then transported around the body. Lipids are made out of fatty acids and glycerol. They're going to be absorbed into the lymphatic capillaries instead. And the lymphatic capillaries, as we learned in the lymphatic system, kind of take another pathway but eventually make it back to the blood system at the heart. Also, nucleotides, which are the building blocks of nucleic acids, can be absorbed too and delivered to your cells, and your cells could use those nucleotides in things like cell division and DNA replication to make more copies of DNA before cells divide. This is just a more elaborate picture showing the lining of the small intestine and all those folds, which are called villi, and then the folds on top of the villi, which are called microvilli. And if we zoom into this picture, we could see that the blood capillaries come in very close contact with these microvilli, and that allows for those amino acids and monosaccharides to be absorbed by diffusion into the blood, and the fatty acids and glycerol that make up lipids to be absorbed directly into the lymphatic system before they re-enter circulation in the blood. After the small intestine, everything that's left over gets moved into the large intestine. The large intestine is also known as a colon. So chyme enters, and there's water and there's fiber and other undigestible things in there, and they will start to move through the large intestine. The large intestine is called the large intestine because of the diameter of it, not because of the length. The small intestine is longer but has a smaller diameter. The large intestine is shorter but has a thicker diameter. But in the large intestine, water will be absorbed from that undigested material, and because there's a lot of bacteria in the large intestine, those bacteria feed on the undigestible cellulose, which is fiber, and they use that as energy to help produce things like vitamins, vitamin K and vitamin B, which are useful and needed in our bodies. Therefore, because those vitamins are being made, not only water is absorbed, but these vitamins are absorbed through the large intestine into the body as well. The large intestine has a few parts to it. The first part, where it kind of connects up with the small intestine, there's a little pouch that sticks off, and this pouch is called the cecum. And the cecum has another little appendage off of it called the appendix. So the cecum is the pouch at the beginning of the large intestine, and off the cecum is the appendix. And we talked about the appendix with the lymphatic immune system and how it aids in immunity. Then the colon will start to move up. This is called the ascending colon. Then it moves across. That's called the transverse. Then down. That's called the descending. and then it kind of curves. That's called the sigmoid, and then the rectum and the anus, which is the opening of it. As material moves through the large intestine, water is absorbed and it becomes more solid and compacted. And we call it feces or stool. And the stool will move through the rest of the large intestine until it gets to the last part called the rectum, where it stays stored. This will eventually initiate a reflex, an urge to go, and that will eventually cause two muscles that are holding it shut, and in the rectum called the sphincters. You have two anal sphincters. A sphincter is simply just a muscle that is circular and clamps down on a passageway or a tube. And what happens is eventually those muscular sphincters relax and the waste is expelled and the feces leaves the body through the anus. So that's the digestive system and the 4 phases of digestion and all the organs that are needed in order to break down food, absorb nutrients, and get rid of waste. Make sure that you label your pictures and you are able to identify all the organs of the digestive system. And I hope that was helpful, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.